Okay, good morning, colleagues, and for anyone that's watching this recording, you're very welcome as well. So we're going to talk today about learning analytics and how you can basically check in with your students using a few useful tools that are available to us in our Canvas learning platform and also Zoom. And we'll talk to you about just the various things that you can do to gain some insights along the way. Okay, so I'm just going to progress on there. Let's have a look. So today's session, we're going to look at a few tools for checking in. We're also going to look at learning analytics. Sorry, I'll just turn off my email there. We're also going to look at Canvas and Zoom, more so Canvas, I think, because that's where you get most of your data. And we're just going to talk about maybe a few of the tips and a kind of a layout for how you might implement learning analytics and check-ins into your workflow. Probably this stage in semester 2, but it's never too late. And I think this time of the year as well, it's good to be able to at least look at the things, the insights that you get from the data that's generated using these tools. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is the tools for checking in. So two tools that we use, obviously our learning platform, our LMS, which is Canvas, that has various features available that you can use to just kind of check in with your students, make sure they're doing okay. Inbox, obviously for communication, it's akin to a webmail client, really. You can send direct emails to students via Canvas. You can also send to the whole class list. And also that kind of functionality crosses over with the Grade Center, where you can send emails to people in your class who might be missing a deadline, or there are other conditions as well, for example, if they're under a certain grade. The learning analytics feature is called New Analytics. That's probably the most powerful in terms of just getting a at the glance view of how your students are getting on. And then your student interaction reports are things that happen. I suppose it's a kind of a basic report that you can run across all your modules. So that's one of the, I suppose, the unique tools that actually gives you a report of all modules you're teaching on. And so you can see whether a student is showing certain levels of activity across some or all of your modules. Also discussion forums for checking in, obviously, and groups. Now, Zoom as well has very powerful features. If you are using Zoom for your online teaching, or if you're using it for group sessions and so on, there's useful recording analytics available, and you could also use that in one-to-one group sessions. So before we go on, I might just talk about what learning analytics are, so you can understand maybe just briefly how we can use our learning analytics. So learning analytics as a field, as a study, is a pretty broad one. We're going to look at a very specific use case in here, and we're going to look at how we can use it to gain insights, valuable insights into how our students are doing. So what are learning analytics, or LA? They applied the principles of data analytics. So we're all probably aware of that term, data analytics, and the use of data in that context, running reports and getting insights through data. So we're doing this based on the student learning. So insights based on what they're doing in the various learning platforms. And one thing, I suppose, is that it is just a tool. The functions within Canvas are really just a tool for answering questions and providing insights. They won't be a magic bullet to getting you all at what you want, but I suppose the key is really to know how to use them and know how to interpret them. So in order to have some positive or quantitative or quantifiable impact, we need to look at an effective strategy, and I'll talk about the strategy and actions that we can take later on. So common elements in a learning analytics workflow are communication, assessment, and learning resources. So communication through tools like, Inbox, announcements in Canvas, and also the tools that kind of interact with those. Assessment, obviously, is a way of gaining some insights into data and how students are doing, and obviously then learning resources. And these three things in the learning analytics workflow all really tie in with each other and in how you implement an effective strategy. Now, I suppose this time of year, we're in week 7 right now, I believe. You can see the academic calendar in there. So today is the 27th. Usually you'll get really, meaningful patterns between weeks 4 and week 6. So we should have really good data at this stage in week 7. It should be noted, I suppose, that the data usually doesn't reveal itself until those weeks, really, because you're going to have a lot of I suppose, flux in the system in terms of students enrolling on modules, and also, I suppose, a lack of data to action on, so you're going to have things like you're not going to have maybe your assessment set up by week 1. And then also you need a kind of a quantum of data to kind of establish itself over the course of the first few weeks before you actually see patterns emerging. So I suppose in terms of using analytics, these are useful things to maybe look at in terms of how we implement it on the ground. So justification focuses on the features and the reports and how the system is being used. So I'll talk about that in a minute, looking at Canvas, Zoom, and looking at the reports we can run and what we can do with those and how we can interpret them. Intervention looks at potentially at-risk students, but it also looks at maybe other kind of factors, such as maybe students that really aren't interacting as much, and you might want to touch base with them. And then also learning focuses on learning outcomes. And that really ties in with a few other aspects as well I'll talk to you about. But UDL, for example, is a field that you can look at in terms of, looking at your learning content, different things in your module and how you're communicating, assessing, and providing your learning content, and how you might look at a whole strategy to implementing what they call the +1 approach in UDL. So basically in the learning part of it, we're looking at how we're assessing our learning outcomes, how effective our learning content is, and whether we're giving enough time to students across the board, and also factoring in students that have different abilities and maybe other factors like that. So UDL, just very briefly, because UDL is a whole kind of a subject in itself, looks at a few different things like engagement, representation, and action and expression. And under each of those, it's about providing multiple means of doing those things. So I'm not going to go into it today, but these things help you to make sure that you're creating learning content for users or learners at different levels, and it looks, a big part of it is accessibility, and looking at how accessible and how much you have in terms of multiple versions of your content, for example, or even just multiple ways of doing things. So UDL would be covered at a later date by the department in the context of our e-learning infrastructure and the tools that you can use to basically implement a good e-learning and our universal design for learning workflow. So back to analytics, though, I suppose, what data do we have in Canvas that we can use? So we have things called page views. So page views are basically measures of what views students have on certain things within Canvas. So a page, and also any items that you have within your module. It doesn't need to be just a page itself. It can be files and items, whatever you have in your module under your weekly structure, your topic structure. Participation really talks to discussions and assignments and things like that. Assignments also have their own data associated with them, and then grades as well. So I suppose this data bubbles up, and through things like the new analytics tool and the grade center, we can actually interpret those and use them to benefit our students and check in with them. In terms of other data that's available, we have things like total activity, so how often students interact within the module. Remember, with the student interactions report, which is quite basic, that's actually useful to get a kind of a view of across your modules, but we're talking specifically at honing in on a particular module here. Last activity looks at how often they interact. Total activity is how long they interact with a module, and associated page views, and the total activity requires a 2-minute page view minimum. So there's a few things that need to happen before the analytics become meaningful. Obviously, in week 1, they're not going to be interacting with a lot of content, a lot of pages, a lot of discussions, and so forth. And so there's a certain level of activity that needs to build up before that data becomes meaningful. Okay, then you have timestamps for submissions. So we all know that things like assignments and quizzes and discussions all have timestamps associated with them. So again, this stuff becomes useful in terms of just figuring out how engaged a learner is with our content. And then the quizzes tool will show you things like average time to take an assessment if you're using it for formative means, for example. The Canvas Analytics tracks interactions across your browser and the mobile app. So if the students are using the student app, they'll also see, or you'll also see data coming from that and the web browser, and that'll be available to you in the new analytics tool. Worth noting, I suppose, again, in terms of how the data becomes available, it won't be available straight away. So if you start to use the new analytics tool for the first time, it'll actually tell you that it'll take probably the bones of a day to generate the dashboard of analytics. So it's a good idea maybe to do that at the start of semester, where you just kick that into place, and then that'll actually show you the dashboard. It refreshes every 24 hours, and some reports might be delayed by 24 hours. So that's just maybe to factor into your workflow. And course activity report data may be delayed by 40 hours. That's all relating to how the data is processed. So again, I suppose all this is worth noting in terms of how we approach our kind of analytics workflow in Canvas. Now, the new analytics tool, and I'll show you this in a minute, is a very useful dashboard, basically, for seeing what kind of activity you have across your module. It's dependent on assignments for participations, and also with discussions. So participations are basically, as the name suggests, it's them actually submitting something. It's them participating in an activity, and that data then gets visualized in your dashboard. Now you can see the screenshot there. You have course grade, which looks at the assignments that you have, and they're kind of dotted through your dashboard there. You have weekly online activity, students, so that's a kind of a breakdown of the students list on your module, and the grades and participations, and then you have reports as well. And at the time of doing this particular screenshot, actually reports are new, but they're not so new anymore. So the class roster is a particularly useful feature. That's something that you can run a report on to get your student class list. So, oftentimes we're looking at maybe web for faculty or things like that to generate an up-to-date student list. But there are other reports in there, and I'll show you those in a minute when I go into Canvas as well. But they're really useful just to literally download a CSV, an Excel file of various reports that you can get from Canvas. Page views as well. As I say, they're basically kind of how students interact with different items within your module. So imagine you have week 1, week 2, week 3, and you have items underneath those. For example, you have assignments, you have PowerPoint slides, you might have pages that have instructions or tutorials, you might have video links. All of those things can actually generate page views. And then participations, as you see in the screenshot there, are really things, they're either an assignment or a quiz or a discussion, things that the students actually have to participate in. So participations equals activity, basically. And in the, I suppose, the dashboard along the way, you're going to get a kind of a graph plotted over time that shows how active the students are and how they're engaging with those. The cross-module view I mentioned. Now, I'm not a big fan of student interaction reports, but they're quite basic. They're just basically kind of table views of data across your modules, but they're still useful, I guess, in terms of just getting a glimpse. You know, if you're teaching 5 or 6 modules or whatever it is, you can run a report. So if you go into your view grades in the dashboard, you get to something like this. Now, obviously, I have stuff with no grades because they're test modules here, but you can view an interactions report for any of those modules, and that typically gets you something like this. So it gives you the report of the students in your module, the last time they interacted with it. You have the ability to email them if from Canvas as well. On certain conditions, you have a total score, you have a current score, final score. That's depending on the weighting of your assignments in Canvas. So it's quite a basic view, but nevertheless, it's worth having a look at. So if it's okay with you, folks, and please feel free to contribute into the Q&A or onto the chat in YouTube. I'm just going to open up things so I can have a view on that there as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just come out of here, and I'm going to come out and just go into Canvas. So just bear with me a second, and I'm just going to bring up that tab there. Okay. So any questions so far there while I'm bringing that up? You can throw them into the Q&A, and I'll just, sorry, I just closed this browser window down, so I'm just bringing it up again. Okay, so I have it here. I'm just going to bring up the screen. Right, so this is your learning analytics, your new analytics tool in Canvas. So it's available under new analytics. So your main module menu, and then your new analytics. So this module is concluded. This is one that was delivered in semester 1 of last academic year. And I'm not going to go into the student data because this is a live module, but this is the only thing I can show you to give you some sort of representation of data, because you need students to be enrolled in your module. So me showing you a module with no students would give me no data, basically. So your module grade just gives you a view of the grades on your any of the deliverables. So in this instance, we have grades for assignment 1 and assessment 1 and assessment 2. But really where you get the useful data is in here in the weekly online activity. So this, for example, shows me, if I kind of go back in time here, will show me the kind of the participation data across that module at that point in time. So this was back on, actually this was semester 2. So you see the data plotted out in the graph there. You can kind of drill down into that there. So you can click on those nodes to get more information. And you can also see, you know, what's the most sort of interacted with data or pages and so on within your module. So for example, I can see here this plug icon as Zoom. So this shows that students are quite active in using the LTI in Zoom because this is a fully online program. you can see, you know, the module home. There's 2.2 thousand, you know, so 2,200 views of that. That's them landing at the home page, which isn't the most useful data, but at the same time, you get the count of the students, and then you can kind of see whether there's a fall off in anything, you know, in terms of the items you've created within your module. So this at a glance is even useful just to see how engaged students are with particular items. And naturally, you're going to see a kind of a fall off, I think, towards the end of the module, where students mightn't be interacting as much with some of the content. But then equally, if you had something like you know, an assignments workshop or something to do with that, you'll see a big peak again, or, you know, an increase in views. So I won't open up the students view, but I showed you there what that would look like in the analytics. I think maybe just have a look here now. Student. I'll bring that up in a second, sorry. But the student view will show me a student list. I'm not going to show you this because I have a list of previous students for data privacy reasons, but then the reports are really useful. So, sorry, the students give you just kind of a drill down report as to an individual student and their activity, whereas then your reports give you a way of exporting different CSV files based on data within your module. So if you click on the icon here, you get a kind of a sample of what that export will look like. I mentioned class roster because that just gives you a way of exporting your class list, basically. So I always find this useful. Very simple, and then you can work it into things like how you do your grading in Excel or whatever you do outside of Canvas. Your module activity will give you a kind of a bird's eye view as to the engagement, the stuff that you really see in the module activity, the weekly online activity here. And then late and missing assignments useful as well. So towards the end of semester in particular, maybe that you might have students that don't submit on time. You can view that through there, or you can go into the grade center as well, and you can run, you can email them directly out. You know, there's an option in there for messaging students who might not have submitted or have a certain grade under a threshold. So they're kind of useful, and like all of these things, what you can do is you can build them into your own workflow, and you can kind of cross tabulate. So you could, you know, you could actually start to create a combination of a spreadsheet that combines these different exports, looks at your participation data and so on, and also maybe any other data that you might have. You know, if you're doing face-to-face classes, you might have attendance sheets that you sign, or you might use Quickly to do that as well as a kind of an attendance tool. And I guess through those things, you can kind of build up a picture of student engagement. And like I said, this isn't a silver bullet, but it is useful to just get a sense of how engaged students are with particular content, and maybe where you might need to intervene if students aren't attending class, or if they're not submitting assignments and so on. So that's where the module grade, the new analytics tool, is. If I go back into my dashboard, I can go down to the view grades area here, and that'll give me a place to access my student interactions report. Now this data is based on a kind of a training module, but you'll see here I have just a kind of a list of interactions there as well. So back to my kind of tips, I guess. Sorry, before I do that, if you're using Zoom, Zoom always obviously has a reporting tool as well for attendance. So in the integration, if you go into report after a meeting has taken place or a class has taken place, you can go into generate a meeting report. That'll give you join time, leave time, and you can also go into your more detailed reports in the reports area in Zoom. So if you're using Zoom for regular online classes, or if you're using it for group sessions and so on, that's useful as well for an insight. Okay, so some tips. I think this is just a useful takeaway, and what I'll do is I'll send this around to everybody here. afterwards as a kind of a reference. So I think the key to this is we know that there's data generated, but we really want to know how to interpret it, but also how to work around it and how to maybe build more meaningful data based on the learning activities and the things that we can actually create to kind of scaffold that over the semester. So what I would suggest as a tip is maybe consider at the very beginning of a module orientation activities, introductory discussions. All of these things will actually start to generate participation data, and guide resources as well. So you can create learning interactions using HYP, which is available as an integration to Canvas. That allows you to build in things like simple knowledge checks in your module. So knowledge checks, simple questions that just gauge the understanding of the student. And that stuff can be useful as well, just to kind of look at as a kind of a snapshot of how a student might be understanding a particular subject that you're covering or not. A mid-semester survey is a really useful thing to do as well. And I do this quite a lot. I've done one recently on a module that I teach. And in the middle of your semester, it's a good point. Again, we know that the data is being generated from weeks 4 to week 6. If you can run a mid-semester survey around, week 5 or 6, again, it's a good place to just ask some key questions of your students on, how they're finding the module, if there's anything in particular that they want to, covered more, if it's a tool or if it's a process or a framework, for example. That's a really simple way. So you just build a few questions in the new quizzes tool. And again, that will actually generate some data for you as well. So it's not just about looking at the data that comes out of pages and participations, based on the kind of the basic stuff like your assignments and discussions, but also the things you can build into your workflow. And obviously you could be doing this or thinking about doing this in semester 2 if you're, teaching a module in semester 2. You could build in things like Zoom check-ins. So Zoom check-ins are useful if you want to have one-to-ones with students or groups. And obviously you have the benefit of not having to rely on a meeting space, like a physical meeting space. And then again, with that, you can kind of run attendance reports and stuff like that. The Canvas calendar is useful just in terms of giving your students due dates for activities, not only for assignments, but also for activities, formative activities and things like that. And again, in terms of UDL and things like that, the calendar is a very useful reference for a student so that they know what sort of workload they have over the whole semester. So the earlier you can kind of plot that out, the better. And, all of that stuff reveals itself as well in something like Canvas Student, the Canvas Student app. So I have a kind of a sample learning analytics checklist that might be useful to people here. And this I find just useful in terms of splitting your module into start, middle, and end, and looking at the types of things you can do along the way. Okay. So the start, for example, you might look at an orientation quiz, and then you can look at submissions based on that. The orientation quiz might be just asking students of their, understanding or previous understanding of the topic that's been covered in this module. And it might have other things you might want to ask in terms of how the module is run, if you're running labs and stuff like that, whether the students have what they need, if there's any equipment and so on. Introductions via discussions are useful. So you might, especially if it's a first year class or a class that are new to each other, you can ask them to submit icebreaker activities and just, introduce themselves through that. Obviously, you can do that. You can introduce it in a face-to-face class, and they could do that outside of class. An orientation quiz for grades. I suppose that's just looking at the first submissions there and just kind of looking at the grades from that. Now, you don't have to have them get a score, but what you can do is you can kind of measure how engaged they were with that orientation quiz in the first place. And then you can sort students by page views early on. So you can, in the new analytics tool, you can sort them by page views to see again how engaged they might be with your online content. In the middle of the semester, you might look at just viewing participations and trends based on assignments and formative activities. You again can sort students by score. So for formative activities, you might actually give them a grade for that, but not something that obviously contributes to the final grade. But again, that stuff is useful in terms of generating some data on engagement. And then you can view the grades in your new analytics tool and check the distribution of grades and just see how engaged they are through there. So you're almost like crafting numbers for participations, but it doesn't need to be grades that contribute to the final summative grade. And then your module analytics tool, again, at the end, you can sort students by their current score. You can message at risk or failing students. So if students in particular haven't submitted assessments for your assessment two, typically we might have 2 assessments in a module, you can message students who are at risk of failing, or you can message students who might have not submitted and might need extra time. And again, then I suppose it's all about looking at trends and page views and participations. They're the 2 key things in the new analytics tool. In terms of student analytics, you can run an interactions report. You can view in the middle of the semester, you can view participations and late submissions assignments. Again, you can kind of view prior communication. So your inbox tool and your announcements and so on, you can view any prior communication you've had with those, again, through the analytics tool. So if you go into that student view, you can actually go into those nodes or go into the student names, and you can see any kind of interactions you had with them as well. And again, with the student analytics at the end, you can just view at risk or failing students, message students again. In terms of assignments and quizzes, you can do things like viewing quiz statistics. So again, if you have any formative quizzes, if you have the orientation quiz, you can basically drill down the stats in those, and you can also run summaries and so on. And then in terms of, so I'll share this with you afterwards, but they're kind of simple enough tips, but they break it down in terms of start, middle, and end of your semester. Interventions, I suppose, are at the end of the day, if our students aren't interacting or engaging, we need to think of maybe interventions. So we might think of actually creating extra content, recordings, or follow-up content that might help those students and improve their chances of success. I suppose from a lecturing point of view, that data really is about just understanding where your students are at, and then you can kind of adapt and communicate as appropriate. So that's it, really. I suppose there's no great science to it, even though there is a great science to learning analytics as a field. But in terms of Canvas and Zoom and the data that you can interpret, really it's about just knowing how to read that story of data, participations, views, create things that maybe create more data for you as well, like orientation quizzes, mid-semester surveys, or even towards the end of semester surveys, using the grades area to communicate with your students based on the grades or their submissions. And then just, I suppose also adapting along the way if you can. So if you have students that are falling behind, that maybe that's an opportunity to run one-to-one sessions with them, or to run even clinics for particular assessments and things. So it's all about just really reading the data, interpreting it and acting on it. And the main point of acting on it really is communication. And as we know, we can communicate directly with students through the Canvas inbox. And we can also, through the new analytics tool, we can actually get at that inbox tool as well in a kind of a more direct way. So I hope that was useful. Anyone have any questions just before I finish up on that? Anything on what we've covered so far?